The birth of Jesus from the Book of God. Mary rode slowly towards Bethlehem. Joseph led the donkey, but Mary's condition controlled its speed. The beast walked with a long bobbing of its head. The enrolment had already begun before the tiny family arrived. Bethlehem's regular activities had been drowned in the great flood of Jews. The children of David filled the village and the hillsides all around and about, and Roman officials had established their booths on the ridge road, which went north from Hebron to Jerusalem, and passed directly through Bethlehem. Citizens wanting to register stood in long lines, from morning until late afternoon. And then they ate, and then they rested, and most would return again the next day, because it was such a monumentally slow process. And the inns were crowded, and strangers slept side by side on the earthen floor or in lofts. And the owners of the inns, they withdrew to the small private rooms built on the roofs above their buildings. So it was dusk when Joseph led his donkey and his wife through the gate and into the village. Though there were few people wandering the streets, he knew immediately how busy and how burdened Bethlehem was with this great mass of humanity, because the very air vibrated with their breathings, the low murmurings, and the talk of 10,000 people. It's like hornets humming inside a hive. But Mary had begun to glisten in the moonlight. More and more she was leaning back against the ridge of her wooden saddle and grimacing. Her teeth shone white. And just once as they approached the gate, she had whispered, "Joseph, it's time." The word triggered soft explosions in Joseph's brain. It's time, he thought, it's time. And the glistening on her brow, that was sweat. And for a moment, the carpenter felt completely helpless. Mary must not bear her baby here, not in the open, not in some dark corner of some little village. Yet he could think of no place which could accommodate them. Every human den or nest was inhabited. The dark village was simply a crush of population. And then the donkey shook its head and began moving of its own accord. It shuffled into an easy trot. Joseph called sharply twice, but it did not halt. And because the beast continued trotting, Joseph was forced to run alongside Mary, gripping her wrists in one hand and bracing her back with the other. And the donkey took a narrow street downhill. It wound around the large inn to the back, where a cave had been dug as a sort of a basement in the limestone. Here, Joseph smelled the warm, consoling odour of many beasts, the russet sting of clean, dry hay. The cave was enclosed by a rude wooden fence, and the donkey stopped at the gate and waited. Mary gasped. Joseph could hear the grinding of her teeth and a deep internal moaning. He lifted the wooden bar of the gate, and immediately the donkey entered and walked to the back of the cave. And there were several feed troughs which had been carved into the stone. Other beasts were lying about on the straw, and they swung their heavy heads to watch this new intrusion. Mary cried, and she fell from the donkey, and Joseph caught her. Her body astonished him. It was like iron ingots. It was heavy and very hard, and all her muscles doubled down, and they were flexing. And with his feet, Joseph kicked together a huge pile of clean straw. He laid Mary there. He laid her down in such a way that her robe became her bedding, covering all the straw beneath her. And suddenly Mary threw back her head, bent her torso up at the belly, then crouched forward, howling. And for the second time that night, Joseph felt completely helpless. His face was on fire with fear and with foolishness. He wasn't a midwife. But Mary reached and grabbed his big hands and pressed the palm of them between her legs, saying, not yet, hold it in, Joseph, hold it till I'm ready, hold it. And Joseph felt the baby. He felt the baby. He felt the round crown of the baby's head, all slick and warm and pulsing. The baby was pushing out of Mary. And it seemed to the carpenter that he had just fallen off the top of a high cliff and he would soon hit the stones at the bottom, but my goodness, the drop between was breathless and exhilarating. So gently he pushed back, denying the child entrance into this world. Mary, she was twisting her body around, first to the left side, then over on her hands and her knees. Joseph kept his hand in place, overcome by his wife's extraordinary strength and her wisdom. Steady me, she cried, steady me, get behind me, Joseph, don't let me fall. And she rocked on her heels and she rocked back against the huge chest of her husband. He released the infant's head and caught the woman at the hips. And now Mary, she was squatting, her knees straining apart. She haunched her body down and she started to scream, but the sound was cut to solid silence by the monstrous effort she was making. Joseph trembled. His throat was raw. He smelled the mossy scent of Mary's sweat. Her hair was a thick tangle under his chin, all filled with dust and with straw. Now came a squeal, thin as a harp string, endlessly long. It began to sing in the cave stable. Joseph felt the sound between his arms. It was Mary's tiny cry, growing stronger, growing louder, never breaking for a breath. A surge of power gathering within her and driving downward, driving her baby out into the world. And no! There was a quick slurping sound. And suddenly, the baby lay on its back, in the straw under its mother's, his face confronting Mary. She burst into tears. She fell backwards against Joseph, howling with delight and relief and in pain and in sorrow. The baby kicked and wrinkled his face and began to cry, and Mary reached up and pawed the beard of her husband. Then she was pulling him down by it, saying, wash him, wash our baby. Wash the blood away, wash him perfectly clean. Wash him and salt him and fetch me the knife. Joseph stood up. His muscles did not want to stretch, and he walked like a drunk man. He walked to their knapsacks, and he found there the linen cloth that Mary had packed for the baby. Also a lantern and a knife. When he knelt down and lit the lantern, he saw Mary in the grip of another task, bent forward, pushing against something else inside of her, as if there were another baby coming. And then he also saw a quantity of blood and water that had soaked into the straw between her legs. And Joseph pitied his wife. And the infant, streaked with mucus and blood and water, lay there before him, looking up at him. And as he watched it, he watched the tiny body turn from blue to light pink and then to a rose colour, as though there were many, many small fires lit within it. He wiped the baby clean, and Jesus sighed. Joseph could not stand the glory of the moment. Jesus sighed. Mary uttered a final shout, and the afterbirth flushed down, and now she looked as wet and as exhausted as gravestones after a rainstorm. Joseph, she whispered, please bring him here. So Joseph laid the baby upon Mary's breast. Mary bit linen and tore off a thin strip. With this she tied a knot in the cord that had connected the Holy Child to her. And then she took the knife and she cut that connection forever. And with that, both mother and baby cried. Jesus, she whispered. And she gathered him to her bosom and rocked him. Jesus, Jesus, little Leshy. Here you are. I love you, baby. And Mary opened the linen cloth and she began to wrap it around her baby, tight enough to assure him that all was well, that he was still embraced as if in a womb, tight enough to be her love upon him, even after separation, but loose enough to allow him to breathe and live on his own. And in the lantern light, Joseph saw the great beasts surrounding them. They had raised their heads, sniffing the air. Perhaps a birthing scent spoke to them of primal matters. Joseph, she said, yes? Do you want to hold our baby? Well, the huge man was a plain ox, thick in all his parts, a heavy, ruinous creature. And the child in his arms was so light, composed of such crushable sticks. But Jesus opened his eyes and he looked at the huge head and the beard above him. Yes, little Jesus, he gazed at the hairy hocks, and he wasn't afraid. Therefore, Joseph, filled with a sense of undeserving, began to weep and quickly laid the tiny boy in a feed trough for safekeeping and for sleeping. Mary whispered, Joseph, you bore the baby too. Oh, Mary, she was so generous and she was so beautiful. She put her swollen fingers to her brow and wiped the sticky strands of black hair back. Joseph, she said softly, would you come here with some more clean cloths? Husband, would you darken the lantern and come and wash me too? Come, wash me clean.